You are about to experience Jackson Snyder Presents. We will examine the life of our Master Yahshua by discovering his ancestors, family, and friends, by reviewing rare ancient manuscripts, and speaking to those who know him best. From the Verso Essene Yahad, now experience Jackson Snyder Presents. In 1993 occurred the greatest infringement of human rights when the Justice Department of the United States, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, attacked a religious community outside the city of Waco, Texas, commencing a 51-day standoff between the government's ATF and the Adventist sect known as the Branch Davidians. The standoff culminated in the burning of the compound and the deaths of many people on both sides, including a dozen or more children. James Trimm, who lived at the time not far from Waco, was immediately involved in this situation as an interlocutor between some surviving Branch Davidians and the outside world, getting the inside story of what was happening in Waco's Branch Davidian community, and moreover, about the fiery debacle that became the Mount Carmel compound. In this presentation, James Trimm has consented to tell the whole story as he knows it from a first-hand perspective. This is your host, Jackson Snyder, presenting now Dr. James Trimm.
My involvement began back in 1993, where even the initial raid took place. No, I wasn't there. I didn't even know who the Branch Davidians were at that time. But like everyone else in my area, at least, because Waco is, I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and Waco is just a couple hours south of here. So there was they interrupted the normal broadcasts, and they began doing a news flash about this event that was taking place in unfold down Waco with this armed standoff with this cult called the Branch Davidians. And being that I was involved in theological studies, the first thing that came to my mind was I wanted to know why these people were being labeled a cult, what they believed, and what they were really all about. It's extremely curious. As the events unfolded, very soon in the early days, I don't have the dates with me for this, but early on, as y'all may recall, a number of Branch Davidians exited the compound. And I put compound in quotes because Mount Carmel Center was made out of plywood, but the press labeled it a compound. It was in the news here that these people were being taken to the McClellan County Jail, which was the county jail for Waco. And so I wrote letters immediately to the names of each of the persons that were coming out and addressed to them with the address to the McClellan County Jail on it, with instructions to call me, collect, because I knew that was the only way they could call me, and or write me back. That I was interested in finding out more about what they believed and who they were. And so I got the next day, because I was so close in the area, it was a 24-hour mail turnaround, jail, their first full day in jail. After being there overnight, they've got letters from me in the mail already. When they wake up the next day, or as the next day goes forward, a mail call comes, they've got mail already. And they thought it was what they call providential coincidence that these letters came from a person whose return address was P.O. Box 471. Hurst, Texas 76053, which is still my ministry P.O. box. The reason that was so important to them was because the address for Mount Carmel Center was Route something or another, Box 471. They called me and wrote me. I still have the letters, but they called me that day. So I was on the phone talking to them the day after that. The day after I wrote the letters, I was on the phone talking to the Branch Davidians that had come out, and I had all kinds of questions for them, and they were answering, and we were dialoguing. I talked with Brad Branch,
I had a lot of conversations with Livingston. Livingston Fagan was important because I believe he had a master's degree in theology. I spoke with him at length, trying to understand their theology and who they were and what their thinking was, and the whole 9 yards. So several days later, during that event, one of the things that they all told me was that they each had a Bible study with David Koresh before they left. David told them where they were in biblical prophecies and cited certain biblical passages and biblical prophecy. Identifying the tanks with the chariots clamoring around in Nahum, and Zechariah 14 with the chapter 1 with the nations surrounding them, and so on. I thought, well, this prophetic outlook, understanding what these people are thinking, could be critical to arriving at a peaceful resolution to this thing. These people don't think like bank robbers. They're not, they don't value what bank robbers value. They don't value money. They value souls. And so on. So these are people of faith. So I contacted the FBI to tell them I had been communicating with these people, trying to figure out, academically what they believe. And I had information that could be useful, hopefully. And I was told not to worry about it. They had experts working on it. They had it all and they brushed me off. Several days later, what happened is, if many of you may have followed the things as they unfolded at the time or read about it, a couple of bona fide scholars, Dr. Philip Arnold, who's got a degree from Rice University and who ran a doctorate in theology from Rice University, who still runs an organization called Reunion Institute out of Houston, Texas, and Dr. James Tabor, whom some of you know.
Okay, and so as a result of that phone call, I came and I worked closely with Dr. Philip Arnold and Dr. James Tabor behind the scenes to figure out what these people believed, or more about what these people believed at that point, because I was already learning quite a bit. The FBI really didn't listen to us. And one of the things the particular prophet didn't listen to us was we told them that they needed to let David write his 7 seals message up, and they agreed to let him write it up, but they didn't keep their word, and they instead began pushing matters. Now, I don't believe that the government started the fire because I understand the theology. Let me explain what I mean. The Branch Davidians, I believe, started the fire, but they didn't start the fire in an attempt to commit suicide. They believed in a prophecy that had been spoken about in Branch Davidian writings for decades about the wall of fire that would surround Jerusalem and protect it from its enemies in the last days. When it was surrounded in Zechariah 14:1. And that's where they believed they were, biblical prophecy. They believed that they were allegorical Jerusalem and that the nations had surrounded them, and the tanks outside were the chariots spoken of in Nahum playing around in the streets and so on. That was their view. And they believed that this wall of fire, and David, I was privy to listen to the negotiation tapes. In fact, I ended up with a copy of the negotiation tapes by the time this was all over. And David told the FBI that the FBI negotiator, he talked to him about the wall of fire prophecy. And he talked to them about how he and his companions would be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And that the fire would have no power over them, that would destroy their enemies. And they actually believed that this power, that they would either be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, or that they might be translated by this fire in chariots of fire into a heavenly army. And this had all been talked about in their prophecies going back decades. So this is nothing new. Whether it was literal Jerusalem or allegorical Waco, it changed the things over time from various interpretations and from David's interpretation. Something that they could have known and should have known, the FBI. And certainly the FBI and the ATF before them committed atrocities during the siege from the very beginning that they could have known and should have known about the fire.
and yet pushed matters, withheld the fire trucks, didn't have a plan for a fire. On that day that they were pushing matters, they shot tear gas into the building, or CS gas, and they did that. It was later revealed in the congressional hearings, targeting the children because they knew they didn't have tear gas masks or gas masks for the children. They knew the adults had gas masks, so they knew that the adults would not be impacted by the CS gas, but that the children would be. The government hoped that by targeting the children, the parents would feel sorry for the children and come out with the children. It was revealed that the government actually, the very same government that turns around and tells us that they have an overriding interest in the welfare of children, targeted children with CS gas to try and intimidate adults. After events finished unfolding and after the fire, during this time, let me back up a little bit, that I was talking to the Branch Davidians while they were in jail. They put me in touch with Branch Davidians that were not even at Mount Carmel at the time, that were at large. And so I was in communication with some of those, including Maribel Jones, who was David's first and primary wife, Rachel Jones' mother. So David's mother-in-law. Terry Jones was inside with David. But Maribel Jones lived in a trailer where she cared for some of the elderly Branch Davidians. She was elderly too. And they lived in this trailer house together away from Mount Carmel. I talked to Maribel, and Maribel, one of the things she sent me at the time was a photocopy of a chart that David had drawn, laying out biblical prophecy in this chart as he understood it, and sort of one of these, almost like these timelines that you see, going from creation or whatnot. I think that this one was more a biblical prophecy kind of chart. And it was hand drawn, and she said, David drew this, and she had a photocopy of it. So I became something of a clearinghouse during this time of Branch Davidian materials, which were fairly rare, becoming fairly rare. Or it was always a very small group. I began to amass a collection of cassette tapes of teaching by David Koresh and by previous Branch Davidian leaders, particularly his immediate predecessor, Lois Roden, and one by Ben Roden. A number of tracts, dozens of tracts and publications printed. They used to have a print house at one time, a small print house on the property. They even used to have Branch Davidian Sabbath school studies that they sent out all over the world for many years. And I've got a whole stack of most of the issues of those. And so anyway, I began to collect all these materials and be sort of a clearinghouse where people would come to and say, well, I've got this, what do you trade me for that? Well, I've got this other thing that you don't have, and we would trade, and I became sort of the central hub of this kind of trading in Branch Davidian tapes and documents and so on. And then after that, what happened is that after the fire, the banker, they had a second piece of property that they owned in Palestine, Texas, where they had stayed for a while before there's a long story behind it. I don't know if I have time to go into it. We'll see. Where they had lived in Palestine. They had been, David Koresh and his followers had temporarily been run off from Mount Carmel Center by George Roden, which was Lois and Ben Roden's son. By this time, Ben Roden had died. Lois Roden had become apparently sexually involved with David. That ended badly. There were other things that transpired, and George Roden became very insensitive. He was a pretty dangerous man. He eventually went to the insane asylum for murdering somebody with an axe. So George Roden was a bad guy. And George Roden chased them off the property, and they all gathered in the school bus, and they went to find some other small piece of property to live on, and they began buying, I think they were making payments on, but they might have been renting this piece of property. I think they were making payments on this piece of property in Palestine, Texas. And they thought, well, this is, interestingly prophetic that this piece of property is in Palestine, or Palestine. So they lived there for a while, and before George Roden went to prison, and then they moved back to the property, the Mount Carmel Center property again. But they left a lot of things behind there, and they also left people living there because they continued to make payments on the property, and they continued to own that piece of property. But of course, after the fire, when David Koresh and the bulk of the Branch Davidians died, the payments stopped coming to the bank for the piece of property in Palestine. And so the banker repossessed the property, and so the banker went out to the piece of property in Palestine, and he found all kinds of tapes and tracts and books and booklets, and he gathered all the stuff together. He said, well, it would be a shame to just throw this away. It's surely of historical value or of sociological value to scholars or somebody. So he gathered it all together and put it in a couple of big boxes. And he called Dr. Arnold and Dr. Tabor and he said, what do I do with this? Where should I send this? And they told him, well, James Trimm is the real guy. You should send it to him. So he sent it to me, and I still have it. I still have all those materials. It became part of my collection. So that's how I got involved in the whole matter of the Branch Davidian issue very early on, and how I amassed such a large amount of materials and a body of knowledge about the Branch Davidians, who they were, what they believed. That's where I came into it. I guess next what I'll do is I'll talk about the brief history of the Branch Davidians and where they come from and who they were. We start out with the Millerites. And some of you may or may not be familiar with the origins of the Millerite groups. Some of the Millerite groups that still exist that we consider Millerite groups go back to the ministry of William Miller in the 1800s, are the Seventh-day Adventists, quite obviously. The old Worldwide Church of God and all the splinter groups that came off from it, because the old Worldwide Church of God, some do not know this, had itself split off from the Church of God Seventh Day, which was one of the old Millerite groups, and it still exists, by the way, the Church of God Seventh Day. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, although they are not Seventh-day Sabbath keepers, do in fact also go back to the old Millerite groups. And so and then of course the Assemblies of Yahweh, which were actually a split off from the Church of God Seventh Day back in the 1920s, I think late 1920s. It was maybe around 1929. I'm kind of going by memory here. A guy named Dodd, a pastor by the name of Dodd in the Church of God Seventh Day, started learning things about sacred names, and he was one of their big leaders. He went to one of their annual conference. Dodd did, and he opened up his presentation by saying, I am Antichrist. And before I finish this teaching, some of you may be Antichrist as well. And of course, that certainly got people's attention. That shook things up. And of course, his teaching was, against using the word Christ instead using the word Messiah, and so on. And that's how the Assemblies of Yahweh were born, out of that. So the Yahwist movement really goes back. It was a Millerite movement. But let's go back to the Seventh-day Adventists. The Millerites, this guy William Miller was a preacher, Baptist preacher, I believe, in the 1800s. And he did a study of the Bible, and he really didn't use any commentaries at all. He just opened up the Bible and started studying it. And he came to the conclusion from his interpretation of Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. I'll read that real quickly here. Daniel 8:14. He came to the conclusion that this passage, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed, was a prophecy of the return of the Messiah. And the cleansing of the sanctuary was the judgment of earth. And that the 2,300 days were really 2,300 years, and that they began at the same time as the weeks of years spoken of in Daniel 9:27, as the Artaxerxes decree, I believe, at whatever point that they used. And they counted forward, he came to the year 1843 initially, but later he decided he miscalculated because he needed to use Hebrew years, and so what he was really looking for was 1844, and the Day of Atonement, 1844, as I recall. And so everybody, he'd been teaching all over the country and gathering followers that were really excited and expecting the return of the Messiah, the beginning of the second advent of Christ, if you will. And there was all of this excitement, and of course, we know the prophecy failed. Didn't happen. Well, I'm keeping a long story short. There's a lot more to this story, but a woman named Ellen Dole, who later married and became Ellen G. White, had a dream. And she was part of this Millerite movement. And in her dream, it was revealed to her that William Miller was right, but he was wrong. He was right about the timing of the prophecy, but he was wrong about what happened. That wasn't a prophecy of the Messiah returning to the earth, but rather that when the Messiah died, he entered into the heavenly holy of holies, or he entered into the heavenly outer court, actually. And it wasn't until 1844, on Yom Kippur, they entered into the Holy of Holies and began what was called the investigative judgment of mankind. And the investigative judgment, you see, would precede the executive judgment and the actual return of the Messiah, which would come later. And so the William Miller's prophecy was rescued, if you will, or his interpretation was rescued, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church was born, which still exists today. So in 1929, fast forwarding in time, along comes a man named Victor Hadeff. Victor Hadeff was a immigrant from Eastern Europe who came to the conclusion that the scriptures were sort of symbolic code. In fact, one of the editions of some of his teachings here is actually called the Symbolic Code series. So Victor Hadeff started teaching a message which he called the Shepherd's Rod, the big thick volume of his teachings called the Shepherd's Rod series. And he started teaching, his primary message was that there would be a premillennial kingdom in Israel, in the land of Israel, and that this premillennial kingdom in the land of Israel, the Messiah would rule side by side, or under him would have a lieutenant, and the Messiah would be a lieutenant, which would be an atypical David. It was very similar teaching, by the way, used to exist in the old worldwide Church of God. I don't know if Armstrong got it from Hadeff or not, but so this was Hadeff's teaching. And Hadeff began quickly, he started out within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, just teaching his message, his Shepherd's Rod message, within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But soon, the Seventh-day Adventist Church decided that his teachings were heretical, and they excommunicated him and his followers. And so they became an independent organization called the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. And even though they are excommunicated, they still consider themselves Seventh-day Adventists, but they consider themselves Davidian Seventh-day Adventists because they believed in this coming Davidic leader that would be this lieutenant of the Messiah, if you will. In 1935, having been excommunicated from the main church, they decided they needed a headquarters, and they decided that this headquarters should be in Texas, because Texas was central to the United States. They wanted it to be in the South, but it was also kind of central and close by to Central America and South America. They had their eyes on missionary work and growth. And so they acquired a piece of property. In fact, the Symbolic Code volume I have here is a reprint of their old newsletters that they published back in the day called the Symbolic Code. And the Symbolic Code News, April 15th, 1935, has a long article talking about this, but it says, consequently, the Lone Star State, being in the midst of the land of both Americas, north and south, is a place where we must set the camp, so that the light may be equally diffused east and west, north and south. Moreover, the camp from where the battering rams are to be sent naturally must be centrally located, so the distance between the rams and the camp may be cut down to 1/2, thus reducing the time and the cost of transportation and supplies as well as mailing. We thank God for such a wise plan as this. Therefore, he has given us one of his beautiful lakeside hills adjacent to Waco, Texas, a city of about 60,000, yet far enough from it to be away from the world and its evil environment, about 5 miles from the center of the city and about 2.5 miles from the city limits. There lies 189 acres of land for our camp. And they set up camp in this, and they built basically a small community in this wilderness area at the time. This is not the area you know later as Mount Carmel Center, although they called it Mount Carmel. They called it Mount Carmel Center. This is actually later becomes known as Old Mount Carmel Center. And they built buildings. They built a little clock tower, like old downtown. And the clock tower didn't have a functioning clock. Instead, the big clock face on the clock tower always read 5 minutes until midnight. And it was there to be a constant reminder to the community that we were in the final hour. And so this community thrives to a certain extent as a sub-community within the Seventh-day Adventist movement. Some couple of quick interesting things about Hadeff and his movement. First of all, there's an article that still circulates around about the Book of Jasher that was written by one of the Davidians that's still around. The Davidian is long dead, but the article is still around, circulates. So they took some interest in the Book of Jasher. But what's really another interesting thing that I found is that back in the 1950s, Victor Houteff wrote a rebuttal to the lunar Sabbath theory. Another interesting thing that I found is that back in the 1950s, Victor Houteff wrote a rebuttal to the lunar Sabbath theory. And frankly, until I found this out, I didn't realize the lunar Sabbath theory had even existed in the 1950s.
This is Commander Lee. We've got to take a break now for some important but feckless platitudes. We'll be right back after you get your daily dose. We're back. I hope you enjoyed the feckless platitudes.
1950s. So he wrote the first known rebuttal to the lunar Sabbath theory. A little bit different lunar Sabbath theory than the one that circulates now, but it was circulating then, and I actually republished it on Nazarene Space a year or two ago, probably about a year ago. His little rebuttal that he wrote at the time. So in 1955, Victor Houteff died. And when Victor Houteff died, there was a bit of jockeying for position over who was going to become his successor. This typically happens when a small, intense religious group doesn't have a clear line of succession, sometimes even when they do. When Joseph Smith died, for example, there was a big crisis in the early Mormon church over who was going to be his successor. Brigham Young was selected by their 12 apostles. At the same time, Sidney Rigdon, who was the surviving member of the first presidency, said, no. The president and the other member of the first presidency died. I'm the surviving member of the first presidency. I'm the leader. And then there was another guy named James Strain who comes along and says, no, I've got a letter here, which widely believed to have been forged, that Joseph Smith wrote declaring me to be his successor. And then there was a rumor circulating that Joseph Smith apparently had designated his son to be his successor. So there was all these different groups and things that happened. Well, likewise, when Houteff died, there were different people that jockeyed for position. There was a clear line of succession. Houteff had declared his wife to be his successor. Now, his wife was much younger than Florence Houteff. And so she took over. A lot of people didn't like the fact that she took over because they really, I don't think, thought much of her. And she did some studying, and she came up with a timeline and declared, a lot of people were kind of disappointed. They thought Houteff was going to be this Davidic leader, this lieutenant that would, in fact, they believed that they would be soon, from the very beginning, they always believed that their time at Old Mount Carmel would be very temporary and was a stopover before they would go to Israel and settle in the land of Israel. And so when Houteff died, there was a bit of a crisis, and they didn't know, that some were disillusioned. I mean, they thought Houteff was going to be this Davidic leader, many of them. He never said he was, but, these things kind of, like the followers of Rabbi Schneerson never declared he was a Messiah, but many of those followers decided he was. And so Houteff, when he died, Florence took over and she declared a prophetic interpretation of a 3.5-year period from Houteff's death until the return of the Messiah in 1959. And so everybody gathered at Old Mount Carmel in 1959 for another great disappointment. And after this great disappointment, shortly thereafter, Florence Houteff lost faith entirely, and she shut the thing down. The main thing. But there were other splinter groups that had already developed by that time. One of the most important ones, the one that's important to us, was started in 1955 at Victor Houteff's death by a man named Benjamin Roden. Ben Roden came in and declared that he was Houteff's rightful successor, that God had come to him and declared to him that he was to come take over. And he went to Israel and to the land of Israel, and he made arrangements with the Israeli government in the early 1950s, like 1953 or so, even before Victor Houteff's death. And he came back from Israel and he said, look, you guys are all talking about how this is all temporary here because we're all in Israel. Well, I got permission from the Israeli government, from the Department of Absorption, for us to all go to Israel and started a settlement in Israel. The Israeli government was all go for it. And he began teaching a sort of two-house theology. He said, Judah has already resettled in the land. Now it's time for Ephraim to go resettle in the land and start this community, an Ephraimite settlement. And the Israeli government was all for it and had signed off on it. And he actually did temporarily start this settlement. It failed, but he did. And none of the Davidians wanted to go. He was very disillusioned because they all talked big about wanting to go to Israel. But when he had the letter from the Department of Absorption from the Israeli government saying, hey, we've got land set aside for you, and we will sponsor a settlement for you guys if you want to come to Israel and start a settlement. And, the Israeli government wasn't near as picky about, well, you're not really Jewish or, that sort of thing back then. They were, and Ben Roden got his Israeli citizenship, as did his wife Lois Roden, as did their son George Roden. It's kind of strange. George Roden escaped in the 1990s from the insane asylum that he was in. And when he escaped, he went to the Israeli embassy where he was captured trying to get in. And he was dragged away kicking and screaming, insisting that he wanted asylum because he was an Israeli citizen. And in the newspapers, it was all a big joke. But from my understanding of the history, he probably was an Israeli citizen.
Oh, wow.
So, at any rate, they also, Ben Roden had his message that he added to the mix. And his message was not only is the Sabbath added, which was, I forgot to mention, as we all know, that Ellen G. White and the Seventh-day Adventists had introduced the keeping of the Seventh-day Sabbath and restored that. And Victor Houteff had restored the idea of a literal restoration of the kingdom of Israel and the land of Israel. So Ben Roden not only introduced the idea of the two-house theology at this point in the 1950s, before there was a two-house theology that most people heard of, and he also reintroduced the idea that the Jewish feasts should be kept and that Christmas and Easter and those things should not be kept. And so Ben Roden was teaching this and trying to get this, and he considered himself Jewish, and they called them, his message was called the branch message, and he therefore called his organization, instead of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, the Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. And they were considered themselves followers of the branch. Okay. And then when Ben Roden's son was George Roden. George Roden was all excited and thought he was going to be the next leader when his father died. And he saw himself as his father as the atypical David and himself as the atypical Solomon. He thought he was going to rebuild Solomon's temple in the land of Israel. He had actually picked out a piece of land over there in their settlement area where he was going to rebuild the temple. And he had blueprints and everything drawn up. In 1977, Lois Roden claimed to receive a revelation that the Holy Spirit was a feminine aspect of the Godhead. And a year later, Ben Roden died. And Lois Roden and Perry Jones had gone back all the way back to the original Davidians with Houteff. Perry Jones had worked at the print house for Houteff's organization, had left Houteff's organization with Ben Roden. So he was very closely tied. In fact, he was a respected member. The fact that he followed Ben Roden was a big coup of support for Ben Roden in his claims to be Houteff's successor. So Ben Roden's wife Lois, when Ben Roden dies, Lois and Perry go and visit him on his deathbed. They're there when he actually passes. And according to them, he levitated off the deathbed into the air, and he declared that Lois Roden was to be his successor, which was a curveball because everybody expected George to be his successor. George wasn't happy about this at all. But Lois had Perry Jones there to testify that this happened. And so, and nobody really wanted George to be his successor because everybody knew George wasn't quite right in the head. George ran for president against Jimmy Carter. So everybody was kind of happy for Lois. But Lois was Ben Roden's contemporary, so she wasn't going to live forever herself. So beginning in 1978 forward, the message was added to, and really in 77 forward, the message was added to the Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, which also then began calling themselves Living Waters Ministries. that the Holy Spirit was a feminine aspect of the Godhead. And Lois began publishing a newsletter called Shekinah, with she boldface. Shekinah. And about this idea. And she actually was touring around. This was an interesting idea. This is for the first time this group was appealing to people that were not necessarily coming from the Seventh-day Adventist background at all, because she had this new and interesting idea in the 70s when there's this feminist revolution taking place, and there's this openness to new and interesting ideas taking place. So she's on radio shows and talk shows touring the country, talking about this idea of a feminine aspect within the Godhead and getting a lot of interest. She actually won a Dove Award, which is a mainline Christian media award for her newsletter. And so then I would say up to that point, in my opinion, the group was actually progressing into more and more real truth from my perspective as an objective analysis. Each of these steps, I think, introduced things that were true. And they had this idea among them that goes back to the Seventh-day Adventists, what they call present truth. Present truth is this idea that truth comes into focus as you get closer to it, and you can see it better and better. So you might have an imperfect understanding of it at first, and then as you get closer and closer, you get this better and better understanding of it, and the current understanding is known as present truth. Okay? So, there was present truth from their perspective before William Miller, and they taught that there were these, the Seventh-day Adventists teach that in Revelation 14 there's three angels' messages, and the first two angels' messages are William Miller's, and the third angel's message is Ellen G. White's. Well, it's questionable as to whether Victor Hadesh taught this. There's an apocryphal tract associated with him that may or may not have been published before his death. But Ben Roden taught there were five angels. And the first three angels' messages, the first two were William Miller. The third angel's message was Ellen G. White. The fourth angel's message was Victor Hadesh's message. And the fifth angel's message was his message of the feasts. Okay, Roden's message. He was the fifth angel's message. These messages, angels are messengers. So these angels' messages are symbolic of prophets to come with special messages. And then when Lois took over, she taught that she had a sixth angel's message, and that there would be a seventh angel's message, which would come in the future after her. Well, then in the around I think 1981, Vernon Howell is excommunicated from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He got involved with the pastor's daughter, and his mama had heard about this group down in Waco, and she sent him, and she got interested in it. She sent him down there to go stay with them, maybe get straightened out or whatnot. Okay, so now Vernon Howell into the game. Well, Vernon seduces Lois. First of all, let me back up. He's the handyman, and he makes friends with a lot of people because by this when Florence Hadesh, after Victor Hadesh's death, she sold off Old Mount Carmel. The city was getting too close, and the property was becoming quite valuable, and so she sold Old Mount Carmel, and she bought a new piece of land further away from what people call the community known as New Mount Carmel, which you guys know as Mount Carmel, okay? So we're talking about that piece of property now. But even then, that piece of property was becoming dilapidated. Things were getting old. And Vernon knew how to fix things. So he made a lot of friends fixing things. So people liked Vernon. He was a nice guy, and he fixed things, and Lois took a liking to him, and he paid attention to Lois. And Lois was an old woman, an old widow woman, who was frankly lonely. This young man took a liking to her, and or seemed to take a liking to her. In the fullness of time, he convinced her that there was a biblical prophecy in Isaiah chapter 8 about a priestess having a divine impregnation, and that he and her were supposed to copulate and produce this child secretly. He began to cohabit with them, and her family became quite upset about this when they called her during the night, and he answered the phone in the middle of the night. And each person's back then, it wasn't the Mount Carmel Center that you saw later that was a communal structure. They had a series of tract houses, and everybody lived in a different house, and so the only phone on the property was next to Lois's bed. So if Vernon Howell at the time answered Lois's phone, that meant he was in her bed that night, and they were not happy. So it created quite a scandal. And but in the meantime, Lois had declared David to be her successor, that he was going to have the seventh angel's message, and that he would someday be her successor. And he became sort of her protege. And she took him to Israel. Now, remember, they have these connections with Israel. In fact, Ben Roden, after his death, was buried in Israel on the Mount of Olives. His grave is still there on the Mount of Olives today. And Lois eventually was put there too, next to him. So she took David to Israel to introduce him to the rabbis and the yeshivas there. Now, the rabbis and the yeshivas, Lois got along well with them because she was teaching this feminine Holy Spirit message, and it was very Kabbalistic, very well in terms of Jewish thought on the very same subject. And in fact, she did a lot of quoting of the Zohar in reference to Kabbalah in her teaching. She also, by the way, found that the Peshitta, Aramaic version of the New Testament, frequently used the feminine form to refer to the Holy Spirit, and she declared that the Peshitta Aramaic text was the original and the Greek was a translation. So this group, like I said, they were going into more and more truth from my perspective until David Koresh comes along. And frankly, I think David was schizophrenic, because in one of the tapes, David talks about talking to a shower, hearing a voice from a shower head that was giving him commands. And this is very typical of somebody that's schizophrenic. David saw all kinds of patterns. Some of them were authentic patterns that actually meant something that other people hadn't seen in Scripture. Other times, he saw patterns in Scripture and connected things that you could connect, but I don't think really did connect. And also, I think one of his problems was that he saw patterns that didn't exist that nobody else could understand. And he interpreted that to mean that it was just too mystical, that they didn't get it. And he managed to convince them that they didn't get it because they weren't the Lamb. He was. And let me kind of elaborate on that. When David eventually did take over as leader, but not really directly, there was a schism that took place. And ultimately, David and a group left the original group and started what they called the Davidian branch, Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. But they eventually renamed themselves for Branch Davidians after Lois Roden died and George Roden went to the insane asylum, or actually the prison initially, and ultimately to the insane asylum. They were able to move onto the property, take over squatters' rights, and declare themselves to be the Branch Davidians. But there's actually a group of Branch Davidians, in fact, I know some of them personally, who never followed David, who held to the teachings of Lois Roden and ended there and thought, as far as they're concerned, David was like an antichrist that came to introduce poison to the group and bring about its demise and destruction. Okay, so David comes into the equation.
Oh, he can't hear me.
And David starts teaching his seven seals message. And the way David would approach you would be like this. He would take you to the book of Revelation, to the opening verses of the book of Revelation. And David would say, okay, let's start the opening verses of Revelation. It says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John. David claimed to have the seventh angel's message, of course. And so he said, what does this mean? The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show unto his servants things that shortly come to pass. Do you understand this message? Do you understand the book of Revelation? Well, the person would certainly say, no, they don't. And then people will say, well, then you're not a servant of Jesus Christ. In fact, verse 2, who bear record toward God and of the testimony of Jesus Christ and all things that he saw. Because blessed is he that reads or readeth, and they who hear the words of this prophecy and keep these things which are written therein, for the time is at hand. So it says, David would say, if you don't understand the book of Revelation, you don't have a testimony of Jesus Christ. So then he would go to Revelation chapter 6. And it would show how the Lamb opened the seals. Chapter 5, only the Lamb was worthy to open the seals of the seventh sealed book. And that if he was able to open the seventh sealed book, then therefore, and explain the seven seals, and give people an understanding of the seven seals and open up those seals, that proves that he was the Lamb. Okay, and so that's how he would proceed. And then he would give keys from prophecy to each of the seven seals. And each of the seven, the concept was of obtaining the mind of God, and unity with the mind of God, which David supposedly had. And the reason David would say that the sealed book was in the right hand of the figure on the throne is because when Messiah died on the cross, Messiah said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." So that spirit of Messiah is is the seventh seal book, which the Lamb opens, the mind of God. And David taught, based upon Isaiah chapter 40, that the Messiah, well, first of all, he taught based upon Moses striking the rock twice, that the Messiah comes and dies twice. And he taught that the first time the Messiah comes, he comes and takes our sins upon him. So it's the second time when the Messiah comes, he has our sins upon him. He's bearing our sins because he took our sins upon him the first time. And so now we have a sinful Messiah. And he supports this with with Psalm chapter 40, which is quoted in Hebrews in reference to the Messiah. Behold, in the volume of the book it is written of me, and in reference to Isaiah 40. But Isaiah 40 then says, my sins are greater than the hairs of my head. So he says, look, see, the Messiah here is sinful. But it's not his own sins, it's yours, the sins of the world that he's bearing. So that when the last day comes and the world judges the Messiah, judges David Koresh, they will actually be looking in the mirror and judging themselves because it's their sins that he's bearing that they're pointing in and judging him and saying, you child molester and so on. They were actually, from his teaching, they were actually judging themselves because it was their sins that he was bearing. Okay.
Well, that's pretty
So
nice.
they also had this prophecy in the last days that started out originally in literal Jerusalem, but ended up being reinterpreted as Mount Carmel Center. That the world would surround them, and the armies of the world would surround them and lay siege. And all of this played perfectly into David's teachings. In fact, David comes out of Mount Carmel when the ATF shows up, and they shoot at him, and they hit him. They shoot him, and he is injured by gunfire in his hand and in his side. And this, of course, just reinforces the belief of the Branch Davidians that he is the atypical Messiah. I mean, obviously, there's so much more. It's a huge topic. Branch Davidian theology, the leaders of it, David's own teaching, you could write whole books on each of these things. So, but it's now all approaching 2:30, so we've been going for a little while. Let me go ahead and open up for any questions you guys have.
Yes, let's do. Questions? Can you hear me, James?
I can hear you.
Okay, let me ask you the burning question that's been on my mind. The propaganda that went out about this place while it was going on, was that all the media? Do you think that was stirred up by the ATF or the Justice Department? And also, what about some of the claims concerning child molestation or harassment or whatever? What can you say about that?
Okay, I'll start with the child molesting thing. Of course, CPS investigated and found nothing, but they found nothing because it was designed for them to find nothing at the time. We now know much better. We know that David impregnated minors because their descendants are alive and have his DNA today. But from David's thinking, let me back up here. David's first wife, I mentioned her earlier, was Rachel Jones, and she became Rachel Howell when she married him. She married him at the age of 14. She married him legally at the age of 14. They went to whatever state they had to do it. Perry Jones and Mary Bell Jones signed off on it, and she married him at the age of 14. And by the way, one of those branch Sabbath school lessons that I have says Rachel Howell on the inside of it. She put her name on it to, designate it as hers. So anyway, being that he married his first wife at the age of 14, once he introduced the idea of polygamy, then to his way of thinking, if he could legally marry one 14-year-old, he could legally marry other 14-year-olds. And so, legally or not legally, morally. So he had lots of 14-year-old wives, and as young as 12. Okay, so that was definitely going on and happened, and that was his rationale. His rationale is, well, my first wife was 14, and I legally married her at the age of 14, and legally had sex with a 14-year-old, according to the laws of the United States of America. If polygamy is right, or if there's nothing wrong with polygamy, there should be nothing wrong with me having other 14-year-old wives and having sex with them. So yes, that was happening. Did the ATF have sure knowledge of that at the time? No, I don't think they did. But it did turn out to be the case. It was kind of disappointing when it did. But it's just the David did go ahead and do those things. As far as what initiated this thing, what initiated it was the ATF was trying to, they were up for budget review the next day before Congress, and they wanted a big show to show off. And so the code word for this operation was it's showtime. And they were coming after David because he had not paid a $500 tax on a couple of fully automatic weapons. And in 1993, you could own fully automatic weapons if you had a gun license. And David had a partnership with a guy that owned a gun, had a gun shop. And so he was in partnership with a guy so he did legally have these two fully automatic weapons, other than the fact that he didn't pay the tax, which was $500 each. So remember, back then, ATF was not part of the Department of Homeland Security, which is sort of an Orwellian name for anything anyway. The ATF back then was a tax agency that was, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was a tax collection agency designed to collect taxes and to catch people that were not paying taxes on alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. And so that's what this was initially about. And the whole thing was bungled from the beginning. The ATF couldn't find the place. It was out in the boondocks. And they stopped a mailman and asked him for directions, which the mailman politely gave them, and then quickly skedaddled on home because the mailman lived there. He was one of them.
Oh, man.
So the mailman went home, and he told David what was going on. David then went to this guy, Rodriguez, who was, what had happened before this is that there's, I think, 3 ATF agents that moved into a house nearby and started pretending to show an interest in the Branch Davidian religion. And they'd been hanging out and studying it. And this guy, Rodriguez, his mission was to make sure everything was clear. And so he was there with them that morning for their worship service and whatnot.
Sorry, but Jackson Snyder Presents got to go out of time.